All right. So again, welcome to the Connecticut Historical Society Lunch and Learn presentation of Skulls and Skeletons, Burial Practices and Battlefield Cleanup During the American War of Independence. Our presenter today, I'm very excited for Robert A. Selig, and he is a he is a historical consultant who received his PhD in history from the University of Würzburg in Germany in 1988, and he's published a number of books on the American War of Independence, such as Hussars in Lebanon, A Connecticut Town, and Lachune Legion during the American Revolution from 1780 to 1781. And Robert is a specialist on the role of French forces under Rochambeau during the American Revolutionary War, and he serves as project historian to the National Park Service for the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route National Historic Trail Project. And for this project, he has researched and wrote surveys and resource inventories for the 9 states through which the American and French forces marched in 1781 and 1782. And Robert, I've had the pleasure of hearing him speak about that as well. It's fascinating. But Robert has published more than 150 articles on American, French, and German scholarly and popular history magazines. And he has received many, many awards and honors, too many to mention here. But I do want to mention that this past February 2022, French President Emmanuel Macron signed a decree nominating Robert for the highest medal bestowed on French and non-French citizens. So I want to congratulate you, Robert, and welcome. We're really excited to have you today. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Jen, for this very kind introduction. You're setting the bar very high for me here as I'm trying to answer a question that some people may never have thought about, namely what happens on the day after the battle and battle is done, everybody goes home, and what about what is left over? And one of the things that is left over once after a battle has been fought is casualties of that battle. And so the question that I asked myself doing a number of projects, American Battlefield Protection Program projects that I've been involved in, is what happens after the battle? What do you do with a dead Hessian or an Englishman, Frenchman, American, as the case may be? And the simple answer would be is you bury him. What else can you do with a dead body? But that, of course, immediately opens a whole slew of questions, beginning with, who is that you who buries the casualties that are lying around on the battlefield? Because as you see on this slide now, after almost any military engagement, there are corpses to dispose of. But there comes the questions, who does that? Can we ever tell who buried whom? When are they buried? Where are they buried? Moats, natural crevices, lakes, swamps, ditches. Some people actually dig graves? Are there mass graves? Are they individually buried in their uniforms? Are they undressed? Do we throw everybody in and let them be sorted out on Judgment Day, or do we separate them by officers and other ranks? How long do they remain in the ground? Are they ever found? If they're found, why? Who would dig them up and why? Can we identify skeletons? What happens with the skeletons? In other words, these are questions that address the how soldiers are buried. What does that how tell us about the cultural context within which these burials take place? That's really the gist of the topic that I want to get at, the cultural context. How do we deal with corpses, friend or foe, the like, and why are corpses buried a certain way? So let's just look at a number of citations that I found to just get kind of an overview of what we have. On the top left, you see Sergeant John Smith of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, who says, "In the morning, we began to strip and bury the dead of our men and Hessians, and we buried 75 Hessians in one grave in the entrenchment. covered them, and 8 or 10 more below the bank by the river. It took us all day. That's the Battle of Red Bank, and Red Bank is just across the airport in Philadelphia. If you look on the right-hand side, Amos Brinton, he writes, many of the bones of the poor fellow that was thrown down old wells, some buried in gullies along the roadside to be washed up, plowed up when the road menders come. So some bodies are obviously found again accidentally because they weren't buried very deep. Just below Brinton, we have Captain Polemus of the New Jersey line after the Battle of Princeton. He says, I was left behind with the rear guard to secure stores and buried the dead, which we did by hauling them in sleds in great holes and heaping them in. Clearly, there doesn't seem to be a lot of feelings here and in there. We just heap them in. And finally, on the bottom left, we have the Private Zebulon Vaughan of the 5th Massachusetts from Fort Montgomery. It says, I went to Fort Montgomery where we could see the dead men lay plenty piles of them hove into a swamp hole. It was an awful sight. I believe that because these bodies have been lying around for what, 8 months or 7 months already. So here we have an example of nobody burying them until somebody comes around and says, "This just we got to get rid of these people." But let's go back to the first quote that I had. In the morning, in other words, there's a need for speed usually as soon as the battle is over, but not always, as we saw. We began to strip. What does stripping mean in the 18th century in the War of Independence? And bury them. But where are they buried? Are there some kind of formality, some kind of service that goes on? Are some kind of societal norms that are being observed? Our men and Hessians. In other words, we bury our own and the enemies as well in one grave, and we bury them in an entrenchment or below the bank by the river. Expediency, that all goes together with the need for speed. Any available opening in the ground is being used. So in the morning, we have the need for speed. That means, of course, that the troops who kept the battlefield are the ones who buried the dead, not the ones who are defeated or have retreated. And here is an example from the very first battle of the War of Independence, namely the Battle of Bunker Hill of June 1775. And there's a burial party sent out to bury the dead of the Battle of Bunker Hill. But what is interesting in here at the bottom says 69. We see that 69 of the 142 British soldiers and 24 of the rebels had already been killed and stripped of their uniforms. So regiments not distinguishable being stripped of uniforms. They were at best in their underwear, at worst they were lying there naked as they had been born. This is the only known order establishing a burial party that I know, but that doesn't mean that there aren't others out there, because they had to be, this being a military undertaking, they have to be orders for to detach officers and men to bury the dead, and these people had to be ordered usually because burying corpses is a very unpleasant undertaking, of course. There's Thomas Anbury, a British soldier, writes from Freeman's Farm on the 6th of October, 1777. That's part of these battles of Saratoga that are going on. He writes, the day after our late engagement, I had as unpleasant a duty as can pass to the lot of an officer, namely the command of a party sent out to bury the dead and bring in the wounded. You can imagine what I must have felt on seeing 15, 16, and 20 buried in one hole, one mass grave up in Saratoga. Speed. Why that need for speed? Of course, there's the risk of disease spreading. After the Battle of Bennington in August 1777, a local named Nathaniel Harmon wrote that it was a rude transaction, but the time was urgent. Remember, it's August 1777. It was better that the dead bodies of the slain foe should be buried in any manner than left to breed pestilence upon the surface of the earth. Not only pestilence, as Nicholas Creswell writes in June 1777 of Staten Island, that he was almost bit to death with mosquitoes and poisoned with the stink of some rebels who have been buried about 3 weeks in such a slight manner that wagons have cut up parts of the half-corrupted carcasses and made them stink horribly. So being on a battlefield as the winner with corpses lying around is not the most pleasant experience. And there are numerous examples of this here. For example, the Battle of Fort Anne in July 1777. George Fox of the 47th Regiment of Foot writes that he marched to Fort Anne and camped there. The smell so offensive of the hill that a party of us were ordered to go and bury the dead bodies of the 9th Regiment and the rebels. Nobody likes to go out there and bury the dead, because in this case, even the English soldiers of the 9th Regiment, British Army, are still lying out there and have not been buried. One other example, now on the other end of the country, namely the Siege of Yorktown, and here we have an example of bodies actually being found. This is during excavations of work in 1936. A grave containing 3 bodies was found, presumably those of 3 of the defenders which had been buried at once, as a large number of shell fragments were found among the bones. They were placed in separate concrete casts, numbered, and reburied. They were buried at once wherever they had been killed, in this case in the Fusilier Redoubt, and they finally got a decent burial after they had been found in 1936. Okay, we've talked about mass graves, soldiers being buried. Is there a distinction between officers and men? Well, at the beginning, there was a distinction between officers and men, unless the officer was so cut up and smelled badly that he was just thrown into the ground or just covered. After the Battle of Fort Anne, we just talked about that, Lieutenant Digby saw many of the dead unburied since the action of the 8th, which caused a violent stench. One officer of the 9th Regiment, Lieutenant Westrop, was then unburied. From the smell, we could only cover him with leaves. Covering a corpse with leaves is hardly a burial, of course, but at least he's buried separately. And as I said initially at the beginning of the war, that is the norm, to separate officers from enlisted men. While we stay up there in New England at Saratoga, Anbury, let me quote Anbury again, October 1777. Here, as British forces are close to surrendering and in really difficult situation, Anbury writes that no other distinction is paid to officer or soldier other than the officers are put in a hole by themselves. Our army abounded with young officers in the subaltern line, and in the course of this unpleasant duty, 3 of the 20th Regiment were interred together, the age of the eldest not exceeding 17. Or Roger Lamb, whose name some of you may know, he writes in September 1770, the only tribute of respect to fallen officers was to bury them by themselves without throwing them into the common grave. But that is, as I said, that's an exception to the rule, and becomes less and less common as the war progresses. Though, of course, we do have some examples. Here's the headstone of the grave of Captain William Leslie in Plaquemine, who was killed in the Battle of Princeton. But Leslie is the son of the Earl of Leven and is a good friend of Benjamin Rush. And Benjamin Rush, though, takes care that Captain Leslie will receive a decent, Christian burial. Something similar we have at the Battle of Red Bank too, where, as I said earlier, the soldiers had just been thrown into the ditch, and by the bank of the river, Count Donop, he gets his own, as you see here, his own separate grave, and the officers as well, as you see in this detail from a map by Ewald. Other officers that get their separate graves is Colonel Rawl, for example, who's killed at Trenton, whose grave is in the First Presbyterian Church in Trenton, still to be seen. But if I may go back a couple of years earlier, if you think of Braddock's defeat in 1760, Braddock is buried in the middle of the roads because he was not supposed to be found, and nobody knows where he's buried. In other words, circumstances very much determine what's happening to whom. When there was time, certainly at the beginning of the war, societal norms, social status for officers, expectations for what was decent were observed when burying one's own, at least, but rarely, if ever, did this happen during battlefield burial. It's usually later. Decent burial, as I said, becomes rarer, and sometimes it's not even accorded to the most prominent casualties of battle, because then emotions get involved. If you go up to the Battle of Bennington, for example, Lieutenant Colonel Baum, the commanding officer who's mortally wounded at the Battle of Bennington, is buried without any fanfare, without military protocol. Not even his grave site is known. So let's go to the next question. What does stripping or naked mean when we hear we stripped the dead? Well, let's go back down to Yorktown. Count Rechter, who's an officer in the Royal Depot Regiment, right at daybreak, that's after the storming of Redoubt number 9, I saw the entrenchments which presented a shocking scene, for dead bodies stripped naked lay strewn all about. There had been a night attack that's over around 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. At daybreak, the bodies all stripped. Who does that? What happens to the uniform? What if these soldiers that have been killed had any money on them, etc.? We don't know, but apparently not a lot of time is wasted when there was somebody to be stripped and something to be found. And then at daybreak, as one of the privates says, we began to carry the dead and wounded of both sides out of the redoubt and buried them, again at daybreak, as quickly as possible. Stripping the dead naked, when they say naked, I think they mean naked, is something that happens certainly by 1778, 1779. For example, following the storming of Stony Point in July 1779, a 15-year-old Ensign Robinson of the 17th Regiment of Foot remembers that it was light and my attention was attracted by a sight which I confess struck me dumb with horror. Near me, I saw the naked body of my old friend, Captain 2 of the 17th Regiment, a man whom I loved and respected in the highest degree. I almost sickened at the sight. He had been obviously stripped by the Americans. At Saratoga, again, we went early in the war, 1777. Jonathan Boole of Connecticut militia saw the British dead lying scattered and mostly stripped of their clothes. This practice of stripping the dead seems to have been considered proper at the time, but the American dead were not stripped. On the other hand, they lay where they had been fallen, were buried with the clothes on, near the place where they had been found, 2 or 3 in the same hole, not very deep. The burial took place the day after the battle. So in other words, you see patterns. I think you see patterns emerging here. One last example, Battle of Springfield, where Ashbel Green, who's a sergeant in the New Jersey militia, who actually later on is the chaplain of the House of Representatives and becomes president of Princeton University. He saw 2 or 3 corpses stripped as naked as they were born. And if they had been Americans, I think their countrymen would not have stripped them, but for the like reason, if they had been British or Hessian soldiers, they would have been stripped. Who does the stripping? Well, usually fellow soldiers who are out there on the battlefield, but not always. After the capture of Fort Washington in 1776, Colonel Long saw the British women plundering the dead and wounded of both sides. And Ensign Barnett was shot through both legs, left on the field of battle all night naked. In other words, he's not even dead, and he has already been stripped of his clothing and everything that was valuable. And he had been stripped by the Hessians or their trolls, women who were with them. And I think having been stripped while still alive by the women was kind of considered adding injury to insults. Which brings us to the next question. After I think we can agree that stripping the dead as the war progresses is done on all sides, your own men as well as the enemy, which brings us to the next question. Where were they buried? What constitutes a grave? Where are they buried? And we already saw some examples of, we just covered them with leaves, or we scraped the hole by the side of the road and put them in there, or they were not buried very deeply. Where are they men buried? No more than a rod from where I fought. I found Captain McCleary dead, stripped naked. We scraped the hole with sticks and covered him with earth. There can have been a very deep grave that is just scraped with some sticks that he is put in there. Again, Buell said 2 of our men were killed by a cannonball. A shallow grave was dug, a little grass thrown in, then the body almost cut in half by a cannonball, a little grass and the earth thrown in to fill up the grave. That's not much of a burial. Soldiers at the time preferred to use whatever hole in the ground literally was available. Again, Nathaniel Harmon, after the Battle of Bennington in August 1777, says there were 2 large excavations for wintering potatoes. Mr. Harmon took his rope, slip noose halter from his horse's neck, and dragged the dead bodies of the slain enemy therewith into the excavations and covered them with earth. There were more than 60 bodies thus covered in each of the two excavations. One wonders where they're going to put their potatoes for the next winter. I guess it was easier to dig another potato hole. And by the way, when we did an ABPP project up there, we did locate the potato holes where they had been through ground penetrating radar. But as far as I nobody started to dig and to find out whether these bodies were still in there. Potato holes. If time is pressing and we have dead that need to be buried, even tanning vats will do, as we see here in the Baylor Massacre in Japan, New Jersey, in September of 1778. You know, nearly 24 men of the American Third Light Dragoons were killed at Baylor's massacre, and the partial remains of 6 of them were recovered in tanning vats. So as long as they're out of sight, out of mind, let's get rid of them. In Brinton here writes that many of the bones of the poor fellows that lies buried not very deep, some was thrown down old wells, some buried in gullies along the roadside to be washed or plowed up when the road menders come. There are old wells. That's a hole, throw them in there, out of sight, out of mind. At Fort Montgomery, we have an account that in April 1778, a couple months after the battle had been fought, there was a pond just north of the fort where we found the British had thrown in the bodies of their own and our men who fell in the assault. The water had receded, leaving a number of the bodies entirely out of the water, while others lay covered at different depths. I saw many fine sets of teeth, bare and skeleton-like. At some other time, he might have been tempted to pull these teeth and sell them. It happens after Waterloo, for example, in 1815. This is, remember the beginning quote from Zebulon Vaughan, who said that plenty of dead men and were lying about, and we threw them into a swamp hole. Again, Timothy Dwight, as they get there, the first object which met our eyes was the remains of a fire kindled by the cottagers for the purpose of consuming the bones of some of the Americans which had been left unburied, converted to ashes. And what do you do with the ashes? Later on, they used as fertilizer in the fields. Americans as well as British, they're lying about what shall we do with them. Expedient burials, let's just stay up there at Fort Montgomery. The bodies of several men, they were thrown into a pond, and probably water was sufficiently deep to cover them. Some of them were covered at this time, but at depth so small as to leave them distinctly visible. Others had an arm, a leg, part of a body above the surface, and etc. And this pond at the time became known as the Bloody Pond near Fort Montgomery, but the pond has disappeared. But on 18th century maps, it is still to be seen. When there was no pond available or was full already, and you're up in New York there's another very expedient way of getting rid of the bodies, as Christoph Döhlemann of the Ansbach troops said, "Our dead were buried the next day. The rebels were thrown in the water with a rock tied around their neck in proportion to their weight. They're gone, they're on the water. Probably at some point they ended up down in New York City after a while, going down the Hudson River." When graves had to be dug, then a hole or pit was dug in the earth in which the enemy threw the bodies of their dead soldiers. Many of them lay so near the surface that the rain soon washed bare and exposed to view. This is a theme that we see over and over and over again. Is all done very quickly to just to get away. And no matter which battlefield you talk about, you find accounts of hands, feet, limbs, etc., showing up and indicating where people had been buried in very shallow graves. That goes for after the Battle of Princeton. Any area of any battlefield that you can think of here. In Princeton, the dead were buried about 200 yards from the barn in a kind of driftway, their bodies frozen stiff with their clothing stripped off by the American soldiers were piled in a wagon and thus carried to their grave. But what if there's no time for the military to bury its dead? In that case, the locals will or may have to bury the dead unless they want them lying around on their fields until they're completely decayed. After Battle of Princeton, for example, Washington ordered the country people to bury the dead. Assistance by the locals. Here again to Battle of Brandywine, some of the inhabitants were returning, found it necessary to call in the assistance of the neighbors to rebury many of the dead who lay exposed in the open air and ravages of beasts and wild fowl having washed them bare, etc. That's another something that shows up in many accounts, particularly up at Saratoga, less settled areas, that Anbury at some point writes that you could hear the howling of the wolves as they're out there eating the dead, the corpses, and sometimes even the living who are in the forest somewhere out there. And the same goes here as Brinton writes. The locals had to go out and bury the dead that they could find. However, one of the topics that I mentioned is, are they ever found? Well, we already heard that sometimes the road menders will find them. Here is another example where a school building driveway is being made, and they find a human being alongside of which lay an old revolutionary musket. That fact gives us a clue as to who buried them, because there's one group of people, particularly in Pennsylvania in that area, who has no use for a musket, and that's of course the Quakers. So if you find somebody who's completely dressed with a musket or a bayonet or anything that has to do with war, then it's most likely a Quaker or an Amish or a Mennonite or some other pacifist who will have buried their corpse. The most perfect example of this is at Paoli and the Paoli massacre, that British night attack. Those people are buried by local Quaker farmers, and their burials are with weapons, with uniforms, all the accoutrements, etc. And when these corpses are unearthed for the very appropriate burial site, which is still there on the Paoli battlefield, the burial was done, and let me quote here, they had been, the men who were reburied, let's put it this way, had been found interred in a trench about 12 by 60 feet placed in 2 rows of 26, and they were facing east toward Jerusalem. The hats, shoes, clothing of the gallant though unfortunate wearers had been consigned to the grave with them. This, again, is a clear indication that it was a strongly religious group that buried them, in this case the Quakers, because they're facing east toward Jerusalem, toward Judgment Day. So sometimes you can tell who buried, which group buried the corpse that is being found unearthed accidentally or intentionally or some other way. Sometimes, of course, corpses are never buried. Joseph Plum Martin, whom some of you may know, writes he's at White Plains in July 1778, and the remains of the dead from the Battle of White Plains that had been 2 years earlier are still around. He writes, "Here were Hessian skulls thick as a bombshell. They were left unburied in a foreign land until there only the bones were left. Sometimes they're lying around even longer." When Anthony Wayne is at Fort Ticonderoga in December 1776, he wrote, "I believe Fort Ticonderoga to be the ancient Golgotha, a place of skulls. They were so plenty here that our people, for want of other vessels, drink out of them, whilst the soldiers make tent pins of the shin and thigh bones of Abercrombie's men." And Abercrombie's men had died in 1757, 25 years before Wayne gets up there. Sometimes people aren't buried because there's nobody around to bury them. Like at the Battle of Hubbardton up in Vermont, nobody buries the dead who are there. Their bones are left to rot until 7 years after the battle. There's an account that the inhabitants turned out, searched the battleground, and found many bushels of bones, which they collected and buried. And just like at Paoli, later on, there is an obelisk placed over the place where the men are buried. But Hubbardton is, of course, extremely thinly populated, and people didn't return until after the war. Sometimes the emotions, the hatred between the fighting parties, particularly in the American South, is so strong that the victors simply refuse to bury the corpses that are lying around. The best example is at Kings Mountain. An account, contemporary account, says that the wolves of the surrounding country were soon attracted to the spot by the smell of flesh and blood, and for weeks reveled upon the carcasses of the slain, some of which had been overlooked, others scratched out their shallow graves by these prowlers of the wilderness. Vultures and wolves divided the human plunder, and so bold and audacious did the latter grow, gorging on flesh, that they showed a disposition to attack the living when visiting the scene of battle. And it's only in 1815 that somebody finally goes out there, collects the scattered bones and buries them. But that's, decades after the war. Sometimes they are found accidentally, years later. Sometimes they are found intentionally. Here's one gruesome example of March of 1780, where we have a letter down from Delaware, where a woman is going over the battlefield of Coutches Bridge and opens the graves looking for her husband, because she heard that he had been killed she never found him, mostly because her husband was a prisoner of war in New York City. So somehow, she thought she would recognize her husband and take him home and provide him a decent burial. Sometimes, again, I'm giving you just examples here. Sometimes people are buried a certain way so that they could be identified, even if it was just as skulls. For example, at Bennington, Pfister, who's the CEO of the Loyalists, is buried face down, so that if later on they went somebody looking for him, going through this mass grave, would say, okay, here's somebody buried face down. This must be the person I'm looking for. Sometimes corpses are dug up again by people looking for treasures that may have been buried with them. The most notorious example of this is Vanessa Tarleton down in the Carolinas, who dug up the grave of General Richardson, who had been buried just shortly before he got there, no matter how much his widow complained. There are other reasons why corpses, bodies are dug up, and that is previous to the battle, and we got at Bennington again, a small outdoor cellar formed of slabs covered with earth, and in this cellar hole, those Tories were killed, were thrown in a heap. 17 bodies were buried. They don't stay in there because at some point on the crest of the hill, as another account says, a woodchuck made his hole and threw out the bones. This is in the 1830s, and in the 1830s at Bennington, for example, but at other battlefields as well. So what you have is medical doctors from medical schools looking for skeletons. And so immediately after this had become known that this woodchuck had dug up the mass grave here right near this log hut there that's identified on this map, Dr. Sherwood Richards and one or two others came there, and also to the potato pit then, because it was known that people had been buried there, and dug and found the skeleton still so perfect that they could take out the whole bones of each individuals. They thus took bones with them, and some of the skeletons nearly perfect. They found them lying across, and they were used as medical instruments, as examples in medical school. They kept doing this until some woman, some local harassed them and really lit into them. Have you people no decency? These men were killed fighting for American freedom. Leave them alone. So let's go back to the questions that have been asked at the beginning of my little talk here. Who buries the battle casualties? You can't make any generalizations here. Obviously, they can be friend, foe, locals, who name it. Can we tell who buried them? Yes, sometimes we can, but based on whether they have weapons, based on whether they're still dressed, undressed, but it's quite difficult. It becomes more difficult as the war progresses. When are they buried? As quickly as possible, but sometimes decades later. Again, no generalization that I can come up with. And the same, of course, is where is they buried? Wherever there's a hole. Individually on mass graves, naked or dressed, again, in the beginning of the war, officers are buried separately. Toward the end of the war, they're all thrown into the same grave and naked, because why would you bury somebody with a perfectly good pair of shoes or a uniform that's better than yours, or uniforms, weapons are valuable items that the regiment might need for someone else. Again, officers are the ranks separate. We already did that. How do they remain in the ground? Well, some of them are still in the ground. Some of them are out of the ground within hours or days because wild animals dig them up. Are they ever found? Yeah, intentionally or unintentionally. Again, both. Who would dig them up and why? Bones for medical school, a widow looking for a husband. There are different reasons for why they are sometimes dug up. Can we identify the skeletons? There's some very, very rare examples where actually the skeletons were identified and assigned to a person. But that's very rare. What happens with the skeletons? Again, it all depends who finds them. As a rule, you would hope that they are reburied in a decent way. What's the cultural context? How do soldiers and witnesses react to this battle? Remember, Ensign Robinson is really affected by the sight of his Captain 2. How do they respond to sights of bloodshed and slaughter? How can the experience of battle dull sensibilities? Just one example. And all of these questions, of course, could be a theme for another talk, of course. But there's just one example. Daniel Granger is a 16-year-old who witnesses an execution in 1778. And the man was shot, 2 balls passed through his head, carried off the upper part of his head, one went through the body. I went to the man that had been shot, an awful sight, but not so much to me as I viewed the mangled corpse without much human feeling. That's a 16-year-old, he probably had seen this before. Are the combatants aware of it? Yes, he certainly is aware of it. How do they tend to react? Well, one example is Jacob Ritter at the Battle of Brandywine, who never fired a shot, but on the way home saw many bodies crushed to pieces beneath the wagons, and we were bespattered with blood. What Ritter does, he goes back to Philadelphia, hands in his musket, quits the Lutheran Church, and becomes a Quaker. So he said, I don't want to have anything to do with this. Ashbel Green, toward the bottom, why, when do men fight, are they prepared to die? Fair fighting, family, house, and home. But really, Ashbel Green, the minister, then said, on the route homeward, led me over the whole of the ground of the Battle of Springfield. And for the first, and I hope for the last time in my life, I saw the yet unburied corpses of the victims of war. The whole scene was one of gloomy horror. And I saw the unburied covered with blood, with flies that were devouring them, filled me with melancholy feelings until I was ready to say, is the contest worth all this? And I was glad to get away from the effective spectacle. In other words, he is wondering, are the ideals for which we are fighting really worth all this slaughter, all this killing, all this misery? But again, these questions that I have here at the end, all of them could be the theme of another topic to define the cultural context. But I hope, at least if now somebody asks you, well, what do you do with a dead American? You bury him, is not really the complete answer, because it really depends which situation you are in and who is supposed to bury him, etc. And with this, I think I better stop. I thank you all very much. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Robert. That was really fascinating. Certainly a grim topic, but very insightful. We do have a couple of questions in the chat right now. We have a question from Bruce, and he is referring to early in your presentation, you mentioned British women stripping the British soldiers. And he's wondering, are these women from England that accompanied the British troops, or were they American women who were supporting the British side?
Probably both of them. I mean, British regiments, if I remember correctly, just like the French army, was allowed a certain number of women per regiment because they needed to be fed, etc. But once you're over here, there are local women then who will also accompany or try to accompany British forces, wives of loyalists, etc. That's really all. So again, it really it would something that would require a lot more in-depth research, and the books probably out there already, but I didn't go into that.
Okay, thank you. Robert had a question. He says, I understand that Native Americans removed their dead from the battlefield. Did they bury them, or do an above ground structure, wooden structure? You know, were their burial practices different among different Native tribes?
Probably, but I'm not an expert on Native Americans. And again, I think the burial practices of the Cherokee in the Georgias and the Carolinas, and the burial practice of Mohawk or Oneida in the Hudson River Valley were probably, and in the Mohawk River Valley are probably, very, very different. Again, I'm not an expert on Native American burial practices.
Okay, then Bradley's asking, was there a difference in burial for soldiers that were Black, that were served with the Continental Army, freedmen, versus other enlisted folks?
Yeah, that's one of the topics that could be a question, could be a topic of a whole other talk. There's clearly a hierarchy among the soldiers who are there. At the top of the hierarchy are obviously your own men, fellow men. Then come the next group is all, as long as you are white, you are okay. Then come African Americans, whether they're free or enslaved, and at the very bottom are Native Americans. As for example, there's an example from Fort Anne where in a pension application it says, we found 22 slaughtered and mangled men. All had their scalps knocked, in their throats cut, and their scalps taken. Only one man had not his throat cut. He was a mulatto who was lying on his face, the only one found in his posture. We suppose he was a drummer. His arms were tied behind him with the cord of his drum. He was killed by a plunge in his back. After he was tied, the spear left in his back. In other words, here we have a mulatto who had been with the Continental Army forces, who had been tied up and was killed. Whether he had been wounded or not, we don't know. Killed by the British. So something you wouldn't necessarily do to a fellow, certainly not to a fellow soldier, or probably not even to a fellow white American, unless loyalists get involved, and the rules are somewhat different again, because they are so emotionally involved in this. When you go up to the Mohawk River Valley, Battle of Stone Arabia, etc., the accounts, even the Indians' brand, etc., says the loyalists are even more bloodthirsty than an Indian. Could be a Native American, could be. But as I said, Native Americans are clearly at the bottom of the pole. They are, they're not even buried. After the Battle of Chemung River, which in August 1779, Major Daniel Piatt of the 1st New Jersey goes out there looking with a small party to look for some of the dead Indians. Toward morning, they found them and skinned 2 of them from the hips down for bootlegs. 1 pair for the major, the other for myself. You would never do that to a fellow white man, skin them and take the bootlegs home. And actually, they are tanned in Philadelphia, and we know where they were in the 1820s, 1830s already, bootlegs from the legs of a Native American. So there's clearly a hierarchy how you treat enemy dead in there that you find, or even go out looking for them.
Right.
For a souvenir.
We have a couple more questions, Bob. Bradley is asking, is there sort of like an Arlington cemetery for the Revolutionary War where individual soldiers who fell in the battle have markers or named markers?
If, as I said, the soldiers are buried wherever they're found, usually we have some examples where they're dragged into a mass grave, but they are wherever. They're on the battlefield of Saratoga or the battlefield of White Plains or Bennington, etc. There is no central place where corpses of or skeletons of soldiers that are found are being transported. They're usually there. If they are found, they're usually reburied right there where they had been found.
And this is sort of a follow-up question related by Robert. He's asking, were wooden markers ever used to either mark a mass grave or an individual grave? If you knew who was in there, or just to mark the grave, I suppose.
Yeah. Other than Captain Leslie, for example, the son of the Earl of Leven, the highest nobility, or Donna, the colonel at Red Bank. Other than that, I know Rowell at Trenton is some of the very cream of the crop. Yeah, but they get an individual burial in somewhere. They get a headstone. Other than that, as you saw, we scraped the stick hole in the ground, put some leaves on there. We're done. Marking of graves, even mass graves, is not something that I am aware of. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, like at Princeton, we did some archaeological work, the APPP project, and we know there were some crevices where they could have been in, but nobody knows anymore. They're gone.
Right. And then we have one last question from Lois. She's asking, when the bodies were stripped, what was actually done with the uniform of the enemy? So if I'm guessing, she's asking if it was an American stripping a British soldier, what did they do with that British soldier's uniform?
Probably sell it to a local, give it to a local. We have lots of accounts of civilians redying the uniform and wearing it as a civilian clothing. That's the most likely thing that happened to a uniform of an enemy soldier. You dispose of it for money, and then you re-dye it different color, and off you go.
Mm. Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Is there any other questions? You can feel free to put them in the chat. And
then just forward them to me, and I'll try and answer them.
Okay, that sounds good for sure. There's lots of thank yous in the chat at this time. This was a very excellent presentation, Bob. I'm going to see if I can, just to wrap up here, I wanted to share, we have a couple of upcoming events. Let's see, I'm going to stop your share and reshare for a second, just to tell people about some upcoming events we have. This Thursday, we have our second concert in our summer concert series. We have a Brazilian band coming, Orquesta Afink. And then on Saturday the 30th, we have a Speak Up and book launch party for Matt Dix. He's a premier storyteller. And then on Wednesday, August 3rd is our next short attention span literary club meeting. And you don't need to attend all, you can just pop in when you can. And they're reading an Edith Wharton book, Mrs. Mainstay's View. So that is just a couple of things that are going on. Of course, you can always check out our website, chs.org, to find out other things that we have going on. But thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you so much, Bob. This was really a wonderful presentation. I'm so glad we recorded it for those that it'll be available on our YouTube page. So thanks everyone for coming today.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.